Hi there, and welcome to this Mad Sense video in which I answer some of the what the bleep questions about the experience of hearing voices and extreme states. In this video, I want to talk about how the experience progresses. We know that duration matters, that the longer someone is exposed to the phenomenon, the more difficult it is to break through the experience. So what I want to do is pick up where we left off. So in the experience video part 1, I showed you the key factors that shape the experience, which are primarily the phenomenology and the beliefs that we derive from them. So the phenomenology inserts information. The beliefs we derive from that, whether it be by interpretation or what voices assert or what's happening around us, sort of cultural beliefs, they all tend to intensify the experience. In part 2, I showed you that voices engage us in stories, and that there's a structure to those stories, and that structure sets up a kind of catch-22 in which voices are able to sustain the idea of exaggerating and intensifying our emotions, which leads to the extreme states. And that, of course, a big part of the problem is that at the time, in fact, generally throughout the whole experience, we don't have the information that will lead us out of those intense phases. And in particular, if your threat system is engaged, it kind of tends to lock you in. So what I'll do in this video is I'll build on those last 2 points, the exaggerated emotions and how the information isn't available to get us out of it. And I want to kind of show you how the phenomenology and the information combine to wire the brain. Most of this you've seen before. It's just a slightly different perspective of it. I'll kind of introduce a sort of look at how we can actually use the emotional systems to predict, to show, our emotions lead our thinking, basically. And of course, thinking leads action. So our emotions, in a sense, sort of predict our action. Of course, emotions are something that we find quite difficult to recognize in the moment. And that's typically because it's sort of context related, and we have these 3 emotional systems working together that produce a complex emotion. And I'll show you that actually, we can get around that problem by simplifying how we look at emotions at the system level. It makes it a much simpler way to understand what's going on. Then I want to kind of show you how structural issues lead us towards giving meaning or finding meaning in, so giving meaning to or finding meaning in the experience, which is a much more sort of belief-driven and subjective experience. And that's because it leads us to those things because we actually struggle to make sense of it. So we struggle to find a logic-driven path through the experience. And of course, if we could find a logic-driven path, we could make it actually much more objective. We could take a much more objective view and therefore lessen the intensity of the experience. This is why you actually want to look at it, your experience more objectively. And then what I want to do is actually show you how we can make sense of that, both this kind of intensity, which is the experience of it, and then the progression, this is the duration, the journey along it or through it, how we can make sense of those in terms of our reward progression. So what I want to do is kind of is really just show you that actually how the phenomenon is wiring the brain. So while we're experiencing this thing as being scary, confusing, and complicated, because that's our shared experience of it, actually, both those of us who actually are in the experience and those of you who are observing us in our extreme states find this scary, confusing, and complicated. And for me, that's actually just the kind of dressing. That's the outward expression of what we're experiencing. What's going on under the hood is that this phenomenon is wiring the brain. You'll remember that our process, you've seen it many times. Of course, what's happening is, as we are exposed to this phenomenon, our brain is adjusting to it as the source of stimuli. We are recognizing the presence and absence. The phenomenon itself is changing, sometimes being more invasive, so more aggressive about how it's inserting information or how it's engaging our processor. it's presenting all this variety that gets our attention. These three together are preparing the brain to receive content. And of course, that's the piece that we can't ignore. The brain is doing this just in response to this constant stream of unusual stimuli. Then there's the phenomenology itself, which has these, I'm going to talk just here about sort of two characteristics. The one is the mode, which I'm describing as, for the majority of us, is this interaction between what voices say, represented by the speech bubble here, and what I think, where these are in the same bandwidth. And of course, this is where this jack in the box is inserting itself in the aware mind, and bringing, you know, my sort of attention to my thinking. So this is brain, this is phenomenology. Sorry, and the second piece that I want to refer to here is the style, or what we typically read as intent. So my voices, for example, are cruel and aggressive and torturing and threatening, with some loving voices in the background. That's the conflicting, you know, kind of idea. But generally, as I say, the style is malign and threatening. And then, of course, there's the content that they present, which you've seen, you know, has structure to the stories that, as I say, trap us in this kind of situation where our emotions are being engaged, our emotional systems are being engaged, because the stimuli that are presented are typically out of context or in conflict with what I'm trying to do in my day, in my life. And of course, this is, you know, so my gates in my processor are flagging these stimuli and actually saying, don't like this. And of course, that's what's engaging my emotional systems. And of course, what's happening here is, you know, ordinarily in the real world, what I would do is I would, you know, if I was, you know, receiving a constant stream of unpleasant inputs, I would walk away. And of course, if, you know, the individual who was throwing these insults at me kept following me around, I would do something about it. You know, I would either pick up a baseball bat or call the police, whichever you know, whichever sort of made sense at the time. But of course, what's happening here with these stimuli is that they're arriving in the aware mind, you know, independent of your environment. So what's happening is they're bypassing our filters. And so what that's doing is engaging our threat system typically, because either our soothe system is saying, I don't like this, or our threat system, you know, is kind of saying, literally, this is a threat. It's a threat, you know, to me. This one's saying it's a threat to my quality of life. But I'm left with no option but to process it in some way, because I can't actually walk away from it. I can't verify it. I can't change it. You know, the stimulus itself. So of course, what happens is that it leads me towards interpreting it in some way. And of course, I'm using this my story model to talk about how we interpret. And of course, what's happening is each comment that voices make is engaging a frame of reference, you know, in my story, or engaging a new frame of reference in an otherworldly space, you know, that's asserting a relationship with me and my story. So, you know, through that indirect route, you know, of this power relationship, is affecting how this transactional process is updating all of my frames of reference. So the beliefs that I, you know, derive from this, and of course the beliefs are things that I am deriving precisely because this is in a space filled with unknowns and uncertainties. And of course, the mind doesn't like uncertainty. So what I do is I form beliefs about it. Some of those beliefs are the things that I interpret from the way that I experience the phenomenon. So early on, I heard two people talking about what I was doing, and I reached the conclusion that it was the neighbors. Later on, voices themselves, so the phenomenon itself, introduced the idea of ancestors. And of course, I had some voices then saying, I love you. And of course, what this did was really introduce this idea of the two teams in conflict with each other. And then as I say, voices asserted all these things about being God, the devil, an evil God, a big man, actors in a conspiracy theory, all those things we saw in the story and story structure, and also, of course, aliens, as I mentioned, and a bunch of others. I mean, there's a whole string of them, but these, I say, are the very common ones. And of course, the other thing that they share is this idea of conflict, is that there are two characters typically, or two teams, or two conflicting ideas, even though the names might sound nice. I met a woman at one of the training conferences that I actually went to, who heard the voice of wisdom and the voice of reason. And of course, all it was, was these two voices doing this, playing, good cop, bad cop, policing her thoughts. They just, had described themselves as as having those names, which sound quite reasonable, or sound like the kind of thing you might want to interact with. When it's in your mind, you don't want to. And of course, all they were doing was inserting these two conflicting ideas and putting her in the middle of sorting them out. So this is what's engaging us with conflict, is the interaction with voices where they have used this quirk of the phenomenology that makes us experience it as something other than myself, therefore, and of course, independent of the environment, and therefore, of course, I form beliefs about it. And of course, the overall effect of this is that it's what this is doing, the phenomenology itself, is it's actually, plus of course, voices policing my thoughts, they're commenting on it, commenting on my every thought. It brings thoughts into focus. And then these two-faced characters bring conflict, by introducing, either the ideas that conflict with me and what I want to do. For me, their mere presence is a conflict of my life. I don't need them in my life. They bring absolutely no value to me. They're a clear knock to my quality of life. Or they're actually, as I say, introducing conflict, either kind of conflicting ideas that they're presenting and putting you in the middle of. As I say, they kind of introduce the idea of ancestors and then promptly made them victims, in this kind of, in the stories that they're told. So that's why I say, when I say two-faced, I'm saying this deliberately, is that actually voices can claim to be anything, and I say, and whichever mode they adopted, whether it was even aliens, for me, when they introduced the idea of aliens, there were good aliens and bad aliens. One was a forward party designed to kind of introduce religion and suppress us, so that when the other party came along later, thousands of years later, apparently, we would be, subdued. That was kind of the story. And then, of course, because I'm hearing voices that say I love you, then there are other good aliens involved. And of course, this is all at the time whilst new Star Wars movies are being made. So it's in the news, at least in some small way. And of course, in the same way that voices were engaging in a conspiracy thought story, the players in the conspiracy just shifted to good guys, bad guys, and aliens. And that's all I'm representing with the two colors of the face. Of course, the religion thing was good cop, bad cop. This guy is the devil is God's best buddy. His creation, God needs evil, apparently. I disagree. Evil causes suffering. There is no way you can justify that. So even the first two voices I heard, male, female voice, very active, male voice in the background, one more interested, one less interested, different ideas. And then, of course, in terms of not just ancestors, but anybody who had died, of course, could be brought into the picture. And of course, it could be somebody that I didn't know that just decided they didn't like me. Of course, and that, of course, was how they then set that off against, say, my grandmother or my father or whoever. And all they're doing is actually setting up those two things. And of course, what that's doing is it's stealing mind share. And of course, and I'm going to keep it at that point and kind of say that actually it's occupying the mind. And because the mind is busy, and of course, this is prodding us and calling up frames of reference, we are contaminating all our frames of reference. Even if we think this is some of us are determined to say that this is actually a good experience. As I say, I object to it as on a matter of ethics, that actually, if it's stealing mind share, it is setting your priorities for you. So it's choosing what you think about. And for me, I object to that very strongly. So it's on the pure basis that it steals mind share. It's uninvited. I say it is completely unethical. It's not transparent. There is no way that you can actually justify this thing as having any benefit to any person or to us as humanity. So of course, what's happening here is that because thoughts have come into focus, and voices are commenting on my thinking. I'm getting these millions and millions of transactions at the level of thought, at some distorted signal strength, usually an exaggerated one. They're weighting signals differently than my ordinary world stimuli would normally value them, if you like. This is giving me false values to signal strengths of stimuli, not just from voices, but because they're commenting on what I'm doing and what I'm thinking about. They're also distorting my normal day-to-day signals and stimuli. Okay. This stuff, of course, is the beliefs that are intensifying the experience of it, and that of course is what's leading to the exaggerated emotions, and of course the extreme states. And I talk about exaggerated emotions in all kinds of ways. So for me, there were certain themes that I became sensitive to. I described, for example, my technology, which was a theme that voices pestered me sort of all the way through. I became very sensitive to that. Voices made a huge big issue, of the fact that I had information that was important, that made me the most important man on the planet. And of course, there was at some point when voices were making threats that this conspiracy, this information would be stolen or abused. I put in a lot of extra effort to protecting that information, to sharing it with others before it was ready to share. There were all sorts of sort of consequences, of those sort of exaggerated emotions, things that I became sensitive to, that were actually not productive, of course, in my life. And then, of course, sometimes those exaggerated emotions can actually endure for quite some time and become what I would call, what we call extreme states. So paranoia, for example, that endures for weeks, would be a good example. And of course, what this is doing is this has changed your priorities, and you're getting exaggerated emotions associated with that. Of course, this is the stuff that's shunting you off track. It's displacing my story, my real story, the one I live in this world, in our shared world. And of course, those two together, I'm using this as a multiplication sign here. Transaction volume, that is plus significance, which is the signal strength, plus emotions associated with it, are the things that are wiring the brain. So this is the neuroplastic harm that is happening, I say, right at the story level, and even right down to the detail level. So my voices kind of badgered me not just about technology, but for example about my phone. So my mobile phone became a tool for work. It became a tool for social activity, of course, what have you, Facebook, calling friends, calling family. It also became a tool for the CIA to be following me. And so it became a threat as well. And not many people see their phone as a threat, but those are associations with exaggerated emotions that became attached to this object called a phone in my brain, in terms of how this thing is actually stored, so that when voices are making a threat, about a conspiracy, and they manage to connect something I'm doing with my phone to it, that information has been stored in my brain, and it's in my history over here. And of course, one comment is actually bringing that up into my aware mind, and of course, therefore, is influencing how I process that information. And of course, this is the real harm up here, and unfortunately, it's lost in the fact that what this process is doing is driving, because we can't go back and verify where this is coming from, because it has no provenance, because we don't know what it is, and we're forming beliefs about it. This stuff is all pushing the process forwards, and we are actually interpreting it, and we're giving it meaning. Okay, and of course, some groups actually, of course, in the Hearing Voices movement, favored the idea of finding meaning in voices. And of course, I'll show you later on that if you decide to find meaning, if you look for it, you will find it, because that's actually how beliefs work. If you believe there's meaning, you will find meaning. It's that straightforward. And I'll show you the difference between finding meaning and making sense of later on. So of course, what we're going to do is focus up here and recognize that this down here, the way we're talking about what this means, or the way we're actually interpreting it, this is the stuff, that's the what others are seeing, as oversensitivity, as irrational behavior. And of course, when it's extreme, that's paranoia, panic attacks, long bouts of mania, of course, you don't give meaning to those things. Those are a complete distraction, from getting on with life. So the language around how we talk about giving meaning is actually not particularly helpful either. And that's why I actually want to talk about the idea, as I say, of making sense of it. Because actually, even if you have sort of past trauma and you can make sense of the experience of hearing voices as being a similar pattern of being bullied or abused, as happened to you in the past, it doesn't mean actually, that doesn't translate to voices, for example, actually having meaning. What it translates to is them actually exaggerating your emotions associated with that experience of having an aggressive relationship with a voice claiming to be your abuser. And so that's just really the difference, I'd say, between making sense of and giving meaning to. So I'm going to introduce the idea here to say that actually, of course, all of that is, as I mentioned, it's scary, confusing, and complicated. In fact, let me go back here. The confusion here is here. We don't know what to believe, of course, because this is why we have so many beliefs that keep popping up as a result of this thing that won't go away. So the phenomenon is inserting information that's provoking the mind. And of course, that's leading to interpretations, assessment of implications. Some of those become beliefs. And of course, this is the confusing piece. So these two together are scary and confusing. This piece becomes very, very complicated because what's happening is each of us is updating our own frames of reference in a very individual way because it's connected to what we're doing, the context that we're in, and what have you. Whereas up here, we can actually radically simplify it. There aren't that many variations on the mode of phenomenology. We can actually recognize how the brain is adjusting to it. We can actually recognize that there is structure to the stories of the content. And we can actually recognize that, that we can map the beliefs, as I've shown you in two other experience videos. So we can simplify some of that complication by recognizing actually that the emotions we feel about this, even though they're very, very complex, if we think about them actually in terms of our emotional systems, we can start to simplify it, number one. And number two, we can also recognize actually that our emotions are also predictive. We don't really think of them that way. But when you connect emotion and information, it becomes much, much easier to actually see that. So, of course, because our processor, as we process information, that's predictive, going from stimulus heading towards sort of, towards outcome, or starting from outcome and trying to verify stimuli. There is, it does have a direction to it. And of course, our systems are shaping literally the information that's available in the brain. So of course, that leads our train of thought, which then of course shapes, what we're thinking about, and of course the outcomes that we see, and therefore the actions that we take. So we know this, for example, most obviously from if our threat system is engaged, which is part of our monitoring system. If it's so severely engaged that we perceive a physical threat, then we have a physical reaction in the body that prepares us for action. And the options we see, literally the only options that we can see at the time, because you had this frontal lobotomy, the system here is shut down. This one rather is shut down. All we can, all we're looking for is how can we get away from this thing? And if we can't get away, how on earth can we fight it? And actually, if neither of those options is available, what happens is that is we freeze. So what's happening, of course, when the phenomenology is introduced, or this phenomenon is introducing new stimuli with this kind of surprise element that I'm representing by the jack in the box. What it's doing is pulling us out of our comfort zone and actually presenting a threat to us. And of course, what happens is, we can't run away from it. I'm saying we can't run. Some of us think we can't fight, and we certainly can't fight physically. So of course, what happens is we freeze. And of course, this is why extreme states endure. So ordinarily, in the sort of ordinary environmental world, if we perceive an environmental threat, we're able to move away. And the moment we move away, the threat subsides, and of course, we breathe a sigh of relief, and we actually see the world, sort of around us again, and then we kind of recognize that actually that we can review this kind of almost in a freeze frame mode. And that's just actually, how our brain is really is adjusting, and it's changing the kind of information that it presents to the aware mind. Let's say, so normally what's happening for us is we're bouncing around between these two systems. We're trying to achieve good outcomes, and of course we're doing something to get there. So of course what we're trying to do is actually love life, laughing out loud. That's just my phrase for kind of saying how we feel when all our systems are actually in equilibrium. And of course this is what leads to optimism. And of course as we kind of see a good future, of course we're happy to sort of build and invest. So we're happy to invest time and effort in achieving more of this stuff, basically. And of course that's our normal sort of comfort zone. And of course as this phenomenology shunts us down towards our kind of threat system, of course what we're inclined to do, the kind of frame of mind that leads to is, if we're way down here, what we'll do is we will act to make ourselves secure. And up in if we're sort of up in the drive system, it'll drag us down here. So instead of building and investing, we'll actually shift our attention towards maintaining what we have. And the same thing over here in the SOO system, if actually we're not able to kind of enjoy what it is, the situation that we're actually in, particularly on a regular basis, what we'll do is we'll shift towards protecting what we have. And I think you'll see all of these kind of shifts in the behavior of people like myself who kind of hear voices. I've done an awful lot, or I've wasted an awful lot of effort, for example, as I mentioned before, protecting the special information that I had, of course, that voices were making a big thing of. I wasted a lot of effort, putting an extra antivirus system on my PC and exploring every little glitch, which actually was more a problem of bad error messages than actual real problems. A whole lot of wasted effort, but because I felt this sort of milder threat, if you like, up here, I put a lot of effort into maintaining and to protecting instead of into enjoying and building and investing. So key point here, what I want to do is to kind of say is that actually our emotional systems literally shape the information that's accessible to the aware mind. And what's accessible to the aware mind, of course, is what shapes the response. And of course, the response is what leads to outcomes. So rather than trying to understand, our individual kind of emotions, because this is happening at the speed of thought, I'll show you later on in the mind strategies that what you do is you actually target, each of the emotional systems and make sure that you're satisfying the systems. And you can do this by understanding the kinds of behaviors that they lead us towards, or the kinds of outcomes, if you like, and principles that actually satisfy the symptoms. And I say, of course, we can't run away from this phenomenon. So, flight is actually not an option. We think that fighting is not an option, and I think this actually is probably a sort of fairly personal response kind of thing. So some of us actually feel that this thing, because it comes along and asserts all this dominance and aggressive and asserts a power relationship over us and frightens us and threatens us and actually imposes consequences. So if you've got the devil pestering you all day, just bleeping with your mind all day, of course that is very, very scary. And of course making threats, fighting it doesn't necessarily seem that easy to do. And of course what happens is we freeze, and of course what happens then is it leads to us appeasing voices. And what I'll show you later on actually is that actually we can fight, and this is the whole idea behind the mind strategies. And not only can we fight, we can actually do things to prevent being shunted down there in the first place, and we can actually make sure that we have a plan in the mind so that it is accessible when we get down into this kind of frightened, sort of stage over here. And we can also recognize that actually fighting comes typically from being cornered or from being angry and angered. And actually we can put that to good use, because it's a very good way to bring us, up here. and help us actually see more information. So the takeaway from that is that actually we can simplify how we view emotions by looking at our emotional systems, number one. Number two is that actually our emotions lead how our mind processor is processing information. So if our threat system is engaged, then we will see threats. Our processing will be focused on fight or flight. So of course, generally we're not operating down here, we're operating up here. So if voices are shunting you down here, then it's the threat system that is actually wiring the brain. And of course, this is the piece that we need to recognize. If we're feeling threatened all the time, it knocks your confidence in yourself. It knocks your confidence in terms of what you're actually doing. It knocks your confidence, in how you can actually realize opportunities. So this is the importance of it, is to recognize actually, that if this is being engaged too often, it's actually limiting our view of the world. So how does this progress over time? I've tried lots of ways to present this. And the two I've come up with here are to focus actually from the process point of view and the journey point of view. And I kind of thought, actually, I've got 10 years now almost, so it's roughly 60,000 hours of voices commenting on every thought, on everything that I do. So of course, how do you describe to somebody how that progresses over time? So I've already shown you how my phenomenology progressed pretty quickly in the first couple of weeks, and then how voices got very elaborate in terms of the kinds of scenarios that they created. And I've shown you how, I was doing my best to kind of understand what was happening with voices. That was the sort of quest, if you like, that I got engaged in, that became, what I was doing with my life. And of course, what these stories were about, religion, neighbors, aliens, conspiracy, were all ways to distract me, to get in the way of me actually understanding what was happening. So I'm going to focus on two things here. Actually, I'm going to focus on the intensity of the experience, so the emotional intensity and quality, number one. And then on the next slide, I'm going to talk about the progression. And then I'm going to show you how actually that this is what's really going on under the hood, is our experiences are being intensified. And of course, our progression is being undermined. And of course, we're losing sight of that, because what we're doing is we're trying to find meaning. And of course, if you look for meaning, you'll find it. And of course, having a meaningful life is pretty much what life is about. So of course, we're inclined to find meaning in our experiences. So even if we've had a bad experience, we will actually go back and analyze it and say, well, at least I got that from it. So it's a very natural thing for us to do. What I want to do here is kind of show you that actually, the process is leading us towards doing that, and it's not necessarily what we want to be doing with it. So the content structure, story structure, and so beliefs are intensifying the experience. So if I'm looking at the intensity of the experience first, and the next slide, the sort of progression, I kind of thought that actually the best way that I could think of to do this was to kind of say, let's have a look at the things that I cannot change and the things that I can change, because this for me was a very, very big factor. So on the previous slide, I spoke about emotions and how kind of, we're inclined to have one of two natural responses. I think when I say natural, probably just practiced responses. The one is, that we're kind of, because this thing is asserting a power relationship over us, and we're uncertain of the implications of pushing back. Some of us are inclined to step away from, and freeze and appease. So say, I realized very early on, in fact, pretty much directly after the doctor gave me described it as auditory hallucinations, number one. Number two, I couldn't match the experience of it to that idea. I just decided I'm going to fight, which for me was actually a very, very useful thing, because I think it distorted my emotions a whole lot less than it would have done if I had actually decided to put up with this thing. And of course, my voices were very, very aggressive and very cruel. So of course, that made it much, much easier to fight. And in fact, to me, in the end, they were so cruel that I actually decided I had nothing to lose. You know, that was another sort of key factor in it. But those are our two basic responses. We move towards it, or we move away from it. So I think what we've got to do is we've got to recognize, well, what are the things that we can change and what are the things that we can't change? Because a part of our problem if we're moving away from it is that there are a lot of things that we think we cannot change. And what I want to do is just give you that slightly different experience and I say what's frightening us off thinking we can change it is the intensity of the experience that voices are able to create. So the first thing, of course, that I can't change is that the phenomenon is presenting information in my aware mind in the same space as my thinking. It's bringing my attention to my thinking. So the mode of insertion is this two-way thing. Number one. And number two, the style, the body language that goes with it is aggressive, which comes across with an intent of cruelty. So that's the piece that I actually can't change, at least not directly, because I don't know what the origin of the stimuli is. I simply acknowledge that it's there, that I can't change it. I don't accept it. So what that means to me is, I don't accept anything that it says. I'm simply saying I can know my response to it. But I can't actually, I can't walk away from the stimuli. They're arriving. And so that's what that's doing. Number two, I can't, I can influence, but I can't actually, change I won't say change what voices say. I certainly can't stop voices saying what they say. I have noticed, of course, that as I respond and push back and ask them questions, it does change what they say. But of course, as you've seen in the previous experience video, whether or not I believed that these voices were the neighbors, whether it was God and the devil, aliens, or whether I was somehow engaged in a conspiracy story, whether or not I believed those things. So even when I rejected them, the voices were still able to persist with them by simply insisting that they were true. So this is what I mean, actually, that I can't really change the content. Voices imposed the content of, or the story of, being the second coming to this miserable character. Number one, being engaged, in a conspiracy theory, that aliens, were involved, and of course, all they did was use those stories to create a million different permutations of the same story of this sort of the battle between good and evil, with me in the middle of it, being given the problem of sorting it out. And of course, what that was doing was, this was the theme that voices adopted. What I adopted was this idea of actually understanding what was going on, because I was so offended by the experience. And because, I say at some point, I realized that actually I was applying my practice of NLP in a response, and that was obviously making a big difference that I thought others could easily learn. That kept me going on this kind of theme of understanding what was happening. This still is not something I would ordinarily have chosen to do. I chose it because the experience was so vile. It was such a knock to my quality of life that I was determined to make sense of it and eventually get to this, to kind of this work. Voices tried to distract me from understanding what was going on by imposing these multiple versions of this story of the battle, war between good and evil, which I was in the middle of. And the experience of these two together, of course, is I was trying to do this. Voices were throwing everything they could at me to get in the way. So the experience of this was this kind of war of attrition. Whilst I couldn't stop voices from throwing this nonsense at me, I could reject it. I could actually, do exactly what they were doing to me. I could, instead of them mocking me, I could mock them. Because of course, the more they persisted with this, the more ridiculous they became. So of course, the whole idea is that, is that hopefully other people will kind of learn from this experience and not take the years that it took me, to get this level of understanding. If you have the understanding early on, you should be able to, minimize the intensity of this experience, much earlier than I did. So of course, this thing is, scary in the way that it presents. You learn to acclimatize to it. I experienced it very much as interfering because I object to this thing. Obviously, it's interfering at the level of thought. It's very much interfering and telling me I can't do this, can't do that, this will happen, this won't happen, this is getting in the way. of what I'm trying to do. And of course, say in my case, the neighbors was the one belief that I interpreted. The other beliefs about what they were all things that voices asserted or suggested. And of course, that's the piece that's very confusing, is we don't know what to think or believe voices are, or why they're doing what they're doing. All I'm saying is we can observe what they're doing. So this is what. Over here, we start to ask questions why. This is where we're trying to give it meaning and find meaning in it. And I say, if we look for it, we'll find it. Doesn't mean it's actually there. Okay, that's just the way the mind actually works. But for most of us, this is very confusing, because this is constantly changing. Voices are changing this all the time. And of course, these are the things that are engaging our emotional systems. This is engaging my threat, my monitoring system. This is engaging my soothe system and saying, I don't like this. This is getting in the way of my drive system, trying to find a good answer. And of course, what I'm saying is we can change this, because actually we can discard it all and decide what we want. And I'll show you how to do that in the mind strategies. What we need to recognize is that these are just beliefs. I know we feel very strongly about beliefs and we think they're true. It doesn't mean they are true. I have these beliefs. Joe has those beliefs. Mary has those beliefs. And all they are ways about how we deal with uncertainty and how we decide to engage with the world around us. And then number two, what happens is once we've adopted a belief, the problem with it is our cognitive bias leads us to attribute to the belief. So if we believe in God, for example, we attribute all the good stuff to him, or we rationalize it. So if it's not actually good, then we kind of, we find a way to rationalize it. And of course, voices have proactively aided and abetted us in doing this, okay? And that's the reason I'm saying they are just beliefs. And the point is you can simply decide to change them. You can simply decide to adopt different ones if these are not actually working for you. This whole lot together is, of course, intensifying the emotions. So this is, you're living in the middle of that belief engine, that's to say, is actually intensifying the experience. And of course, recognize that while we're talking about all these things, these stories that voices are engaging us in, it's high emotions that are wiring the brain. And this actually is the real problem, of course, that we're not seeing. And of course, how our brain is wired affects how we see the world, how we experience the world, affects my perceptions, affects my concept of the world. It's literally changing my consciousness. It's operating at that level. So this is why I'm kind of saying, so if I'm looking at, I say, two ways to map the duration. The one is simply to say, ignore timing, because I actually can't remember, for example, when these beliefs arose. I can do a better job of remembering when my sort of phenomenology changed, but I'm much better kind of just separating this to kind of say, how bad is this damage, more rather than when did it happen. So, I recognize that, all of these beliefs and things sort of knocked my confidence, in different ways. But of course, when it happened became pretty much irrelevant. And of course, how it happened is that voices asserted these sort of power relationships over me. They had this kind of, all-seeing vantage point, supposedly, from which they pronounce on everything. So, they tried to undermine my relationships by saying, Joe will think this, or Joe will do that. So of course, a lot of our relationships are perception of what we think others think of us. And of course, that's the piece that, that voices are actually undermining. So they're they've asserted this abusive relationship by, asserting power over us. And of course, it's changing my perception. It's changing how I assess implications. So this is, this is in the mind. This is in the mind. So when I was sending emails, for example, voices were saying that email is not going to get anywhere, or the person won't respond. And of course, they're implying, of course, that they could influence that and what have you. Of course, what they're doing is prompting me to assess the implications. And of course, as I'm assessing the implications, that's the experience of it. And because there's nothing I can do about that, that's what's intensifying the experience. So this is the stuff that's making us feel helpless, because voices are dragging our mind into this space where we cannot act. And of course, that's what's changing our perception all the time, and of course, our sort of concept of the world. So by asserting that they were God and the devil, and then setting out to show me evil, which my voices actually said they were going to do, and they did. Of course, they were interfering with how I discovered meaning in the real world. Because for me, we don't think about the meaning of life all day, every day. We just don't. We get on with life, and we discover things, as we go. That's the fun of it. Of course, so what voices were doing, as I say, was inserting this as a topic and battering me with it all day for a very long time, forcing me to think about it, whether of course I liked it or not. And of course, because these are the questions they're prompting, because they're asserting all sorts of things about the meaning of life, and I'm arguing with them. Of course, they are in effect changing my concept of the world. And so this is why it's so complicated, is because we're seeing it over here and experiencing it over here, because the phenomenon and the content are pushing our processor towards interpretations and assessing implications and forming beliefs and giving meaning to. So, and of course, the further we go down to how I experience it and how I give meaning to it and what it means for me, the more different we are, and in terms of understanding what's going on. And what I'm saying actually is, this is not where we want to understand it. This is important to me as an individual, of course, but in terms of understanding the phenomenology and understanding the experience, what we want to do is recognize that these things are working together to intensify our experience of it. And what we can do is we can act to dismiss these beliefs that are derived from voices. We can recognize the content and do our best to actually push it away. We can actually recognize that this phenomenon is inserting information in particular ways, and we can learn to actually anticipate it and disrupt it. And of course, what we can do is learn to recognize how it's undermined both our emotional systems and our story, and we can actually rectify those things. And I'll show you more of this, I say, in the mind strategies. So what's going on here is voices are leading us towards interpretations based on beliefs that they have asserted. And that's because our information processing is predictive. Voices are inserting these topics and themes that we wouldn't otherwise be thinking about nearly so often. And of course, I said that's just actually, this is literally just the way, the way the mind works. Of course, if your relationship with the voice is based on a past abuser, for example, then I'm not quite sure what your theme would be, but I would imagine, I'm ad-libbing here, I actually don't know, of course. For me, what I can say, it would be evident to me that somebody who has been abused as a child by someone that they love, who's then experienced mental health issues, who's then gone into the mental health system, which is again abused them. Society is stigmatizing them. Voices then come along and are abusing them as well. And then, of course, they're not understood, what have you. Those emotions are actually building. And of course, what will happen is that if your voices are bullying, you will recognize the same pattern in the bullying of voices. And of course, if voices are claiming to be your past abuser, they are, of course, intensifying your experience. So I think the same layout of thinking about it is the same. Of course, your theme and the voice theme will be a little different than mine, but you can actually decipher what that is, and so how voices are actually engaging you. The second piece I want to look at is the progression of the experience. Now, obviously, every individual, the experience is going to progress differently. So for me, I recognized that what was happening was that along with this intensity, voices were getting in the way of what I was trying to do. That for me was the most fundamental thing. I was trying to understand what was happening with voices. I left that for a while and actually went back to doing my sort of normal day job, for want of another description, and then came back to it again. And of course, every time I came back to it, voices sort of got in the way. So it was pretty clear voices were trying to undermine what I was doing. So because I recognized that pattern, if you like, that voices were undermining what I was doing, at some point I connected the dots and actually mapped the themes at which voices were very, very busy. And then I could see the relationship between the themes, that voices were very busy about and what I was actually trying to achieve. So I'll show you that in the mind strategies, because that's that one is specific to me. What I've done here is taken that same idea and kind of said, okay, so through my journey of these 10 years, so what are the low points, if you like, that I've experienced through this journey, and what made them low points, because actually I think a lot of them are low points for many others. And if we can actually recognize that there is a journey to this thing, and although my journey is of course unique, there are again structural things about how this phenomenology presents, that it actually presents particular situations and circumstances that many of us will actually experience. And what I want to do is simply say, is kind of point out, not necessarily all of them, but some of them, say, that was sort of, as I call, tipping points more than sort of turning points. So this was the sort of experience of them. And then what I'll show you is that actually from a process point of view, what was happening was they were actually undermining my reward progression. And so of course, if I want to actually fix it, that's what I've got to fix. So I started here, so voices, I started hearing voices, out of the blue in about the middle of 2008. So it made absolutely no sense to me. There's no history in the family. I'd had a great life up to that point. There was absolutely no, the fact, the most standout thing about it was that it made no sense. I mean, there was just no idea. As you can hear, I'm struggling to describe it even. There was no idea for me to connect to in terms of why this might actually happen to me. So you've seen my first episode description. So those first 7 or 8 weeks, whatever it was, that led to the panic attack. But the next big thing that actually helped me move forward. So at the top here, I'm actually laying down things that help me move forward. At the bottom here, I'm laying out things, with this red arrow sort of pushing me backwards. These are things that sort of, if you like, got in the way, whereas, where this arrow is representing me getting on with life and actually enjoying it. The first thing that came along that gave me a completely different view, as I mentioned before, was when the doctor described it as auditory hallucinations. So over here, it was the neighbors, which was an unpleasant experience. Once it was described as auditory hallucinations, it was still unpleasant. But what it did for me was it made me think about it completely differently, gave me a new frame of reference, a new language, which is a very, very important piece of what is actually going on. And I think it's actually very, very important what we say to people the first time they encounter help, because that can make a huge difference. And what you want to do is actually say the right things that will satisfy our emotional systems, which is why I was introducing the idea of the emotional systems earlier on. What you want to do is build optimism, confidence, and help people feel more secure. And that's the basics of the conversation that you want to have. Still, for me, this experience, this thing for me was so obviously external, not coming from our brain. That I didn't relate to this term auditory hallucinations, and I say, my reaction to it was, to heck with this, I'm going to fight it. And for me, that was actually also a very, very powerful thing. I think if I'd been along to a psychiatrist who kind of said to me, you'll never work again and you're mentally ill, I would have responded probably completely differently. I don't know, but I think we can figure that out fairly logically. So what happened from there on was that my voices got very, very busy. So it was this combination of, sort of laughing at me and making, getting in the way of my soothe system. So the laughing at me, if you like, was sort of mocking my drive system. I didn't have this language at the time. And the unhappy face was my soothe system was not happy. I couldn't find good outcomes. But actually, this was, a year probably of just this barrage and bombardment by voices. It was this complete and utter confusion, voices being very, very aggressive, literally all day, every day. I couldn't work. All I did was spend my day bouncing back and forth, with voices, to the point where I developed what I called, I don't think I developed it, it just happened, what I called a one-way tirade. Was that the best way that I could actually blot out what voices were saying was to think at them, for want of another description. So my half of the transmit, I just exaggerated and I just pushed back. Of course, that's exhausting. It's not exactly fulfilling. It's not fun. I don't really know how I survived that first year. So it was just a state of sort of total confusion. Now that I step back, I kind of say this was actually just voices doing their best to undermine me, and of course to confuse. The next big step for me that was actually very, very difficult. So over here in this stage, I just didn't know what to do. As I say, I just reacted and responded, to what was happening. If that had gone on much longer, I would probably have just opted out. It was just made life not worth living. The next step, for me, that was actually very difficult to say was sort of help seeking. And first of all was the kind of decision to go and seek help. So I first went and spoke to the doctor, and he prescribed antipsychotics for a week. Because I couldn't relate to the description of auditory hallucinations, and that was the professional opinion, I actually decided that actually going back and getting, being told the same thing again, it wasn't particularly, going to help me. I did go and speak to, a psychiatrist sort of much later on. I'll get to that sort of in a minute. But what I did do, of course, is do a lot of exploring on my own. And of course, what you find when you do this is that there are so many different opinions out there. So for me, number one, the things I really missed was there was no structure for actually having a pragmatic conversation about what was going on. Nobody that I spoke to had any clue, any understanding, of the experience at all. And everything I read about it was people describing, of course, their individual experiences. So everything you read from psychiatrists, describes, this thing as a chemical imbalance. I mean, for me, just complete nonsense. And even when I came across the kind of hearing voices movement, there were two words that just put me off completely. The whole idea of accepting and living with. There was no way, that I could find a way to accept cruel voices. I could acknowledge that they were there. I certainly couldn't accept them. And I certainly wasn't going to tolerate the idea of living with them. For me, it was just so vile. I would literally rather not, quite frankly. So for me, there was actually no way of having a structure. Nobody that I spoke to could describe the phenomenology. Nobody that I spoke to could actually, this is what I mean by no description. Nobody could tell me anything about how to respond to voices. You can go and see a psychiatrist. When you walk out of the office, you're still hearing voices. Nobody's giving you any idea on how to respond. And you have no choice but to respond because voices are engaging your brain and your thoughts are your response. So you're responding anyway, whether you like it or not. Of course, I've since discovered that there are good ways to respond and there are ways that are not so good to respond. And of course, nobody had any insight into that at all. In fact, nobody's even talking about it. I mean, it was that completely off the radar, almost as an option. That's probably not true today. I mean, there's a very recent study, for example, about avatar therapy. And in fact, I believe the first one was nearly 10 years ago. But I certainly didn't come across it until way later, because that stuff is in the researcher's domain. It's actually, it's not even in the domain, of sort of carers, and to say you've got to do an awful lot of work to even, to even discover it. There was no one, sort of there's no projection. There was nobody who was able to kind of say to me, well, this is what you might expect. And if this is what you might expect, then this is what you can do about it. Nobody was able to have that sort of conversation. More than that, what's clear when you sort of explore what's going on out there is that there's a total lack of understanding. Of course, there are some, a fair number of individuals who have found something that works for them, which is great. There aren't many, that are able to describe it in a way, that for the benefit of others is more than trial and error. They can say, I've done this and it works, and that's great. So I can try it and it may or may not work. Okay, it doesn't necessarily add to a real understanding. There's certainly a lot out there, in terms of ideas and techniques, perhaps. might be a way to kind of, differentiate what I'm getting at here when I'm saying there's no understanding. And then more than that, I had no credibility, because now suddenly I'm suffering from some sort of mental condition. As I say, I didn't get diagnosed as schizophrenic until I went to see a psychiatrist, which was about a year in. But of course, what happens now is, you've behaved strangely, you've had these panic attacks, what's happened to Greg, and of course, others, the beliefs of others are being imposed on you, and quite literally your credibility is undermined. So even, so people actually stop listening to you. It's not much fun at all. And of course, everything you explore, so everything you read, everything you Google and look up, online or what have you, becomes a new bunch of stimuli and ideas for voices to believe, to use to bleep with your mind. And so this is the other thing: is the more I explored, the more material, the more fodder, I gave to voices to badge me with. The more ideas they had to distract me with, the more dead ends they were able to lead me down. So this absence of any kind of clear path is a huge problem, because it is the interaction between what voices say and what you think that is the experience of it. And of course, all of this stuff is actually shaping your thinking in particular ways that are actually not helpful. So of course the experience perpetuates, and that's actually, of course, and then voices are exaggerating that by imposing these stories on you. So, so voices are imposing this stuff on you, number one. And number two, there's nothing out there that's helping you find a way out of it, or very little. And, it's very difficult to come across. It's different, of course, depending where you are. I think if you're in the UK, this is probably not as bad. I was in South Africa, and then in the States, and certainly in South Africa, there was, hearing voices movement isn't even represented. Psychiatrists you go and talk to haven't even heard of it. The States is actually doing stuff in that space. I think the UK and Netherlands are certain, and Australia are much sort of further ahead. But nevertheless, is even if you explore those things, there are so many options out there, that you'll end up wading through it. A lot of it, all the research stuff is not in language that's usable, quite frankly. If I've got to sit with a dictionary, to actually read a research article, sometimes, I mean, it's not always the case, but often it's the case. And I'm relatively smart. So a lot of that stuff just isn't accessible for people. So help seeking is actually a very difficult phase. And I think actually the best I've seen currently are the sort of first episode and or early intervention sort of programs, because they actually are, and open dialogue, they offer very practical help. So of course what happens is, I say, this conflict is perpetuating. You're getting all these episodes. I say some of them translate to panic and paranoia and blah blah blah. But even some of the smaller ones, I say, for me there are these 100,000 transactions a day. I don't know what the number is, but it's that sort of order, that are getting in the way of what I'm trying to do. And of course, what happens is this leads, to a feeling of helplessness. So of course, this is a dangerous point, from the point of view of actual risk, is when you've sort of been through this kind of cycle, something new, it's very confusing, nobody understands it, you're not getting, sensible help. It's continuing, in these episodes, which are hugely unpleasant, really scary and confusing stuff, and you just don't know what to do. So this feeling of helplessness, is a very much a low point, kind of in this exercise. I'm very lucky in that I was able to rely on family and friends, who've been absolutely stunning in terms of supporting me through this process. And when I needed help, it was there. I've had 2 family members, one fly from Joburg to Cape Town. It's a 2-hour flight. One fly from Durban to Cape Town to come and help me when I needed it. In sort of an emergency situation. Not everybody has that. And I've certainly had other friends, that I've relied on in other ways. Certainly in panic attacks. And I'm staying with a friend at the moment. So I've been very, very lucky. And so, of course, this is a very, very important piece of it. Another piece for me that actually moved things along was because I was actually trying to understand what was happening, number one. Number two, I was convinced there had to be patterns to voice behavior, not just my voice behavior, because it seemed so random over here. And of course, this was the whole point, was voices were trying literally to confuse me. The first thing that I read that made sense, the first aha thing for me, was I read about bullying. And of course, there is a particular pattern to bullying behavior. And of course, once I read that, I read more. I read about psychopaths and about sociopaths. And really, that's what my voices are, the sort of combination of bullies, psychopaths, sociopaths. And if you read all the descriptions of behaviors that you can expect in those realms, that's the kind of behavior that my voices exhibit. Because for me, the reason I'm putting that up here was, of course, this was kind of semi-frightening in a way, I was already experiencing it, so I was already being scared by it. But actually being able to put a pattern to it made me, sort of moved me along on my sort of path, if you like, of sort of, understanding. And the second thing, that sort of made a big difference to me was that I actually realized that I was doing better in spite of my voices being particularly cruel. I was doing better than a lot of, well, not a lot, better than the few other people that I knew, around me who heard voices at that stage. There weren't many, there were a couple. But I certainly coped a lot better, and I was obviously doing something different. And what it was is that I was actually using my practice of neurolinguistic programming to respond directly to voices, and all I was doing was I was interrupting it, and I was actually replacing it with something else. So I was interrupting the train of thought and replacing it with something. So I was owning the transaction. And I didn't realize at the time how important that was. And of course, this was the other piece, was I had a pattern for this number 3 over here, that I thought others could very, very easily learn. The next low point for me was, just past this point of helplessness, actually my voice has quietened down at one point. It was actually as a result of this. And I had this period of sort of somewhere between 9 and 12 months of what I describe as mainly tinnitus. So my voice has got very quiet. I had this constant buzz, and I'd get this little burble of voices coming out of it every now and again. And it was still, for me, extremely irritating. And in fact, this is odd enough, this is when I went to a psychiatrist. And for me, it was chronic realization. And I call it that because I kind of said, okay, this thing's not going away. I've done everything I can, and it's still here. It's not going away. Let me go and actually chat to a psychiatrist. And of course, that conversation did absolutely nothing for this. In fact, it aggravated it. Because I was told, actually, take these tablets. If they don't work, we'll try another one. And you're going to take them for the rest of your life. So when I put on 25 kilograms in sort of 9 weeks, and was back for a review at the psychiatrist, and I said to him, look at this, I needed a whole new wardrobe. He says, well, literally, he shrugged and said, it's a side effect. And of course, at that point, I'm thinking, really? So now I'm going to live with voices for another 30 years or something. In my mind, I'm now 25 kilograms lighter. Don't feel sort of good about myself. None of my clothes fit with me. The meds have dulled my emotions. Really, this is a solution? No, it's not a solution at all. It's actually making it worse. So this for me was another low point that actually was aggravated by going and as I say, seeing a psychiatrist, because actually the tablets made me feel worse. They made me put on weight, a lot of weight, which made me feel worse again. And of course, my emotions were dulled. It was not very exciting at all. The next big thing that happened for me was, after this sort of quiet period, I said my voices were quiet for sort of 9, 12 months, whereas they suddenly came back very suddenly over weekends. Why I call it a surprise attack. And it was literally, I think voices were monitoring what was going on here, if you like. And they let things get quiet. They waited long enough for me to forget what I was doing here, basically. And they came along, bang, caught me completely by surprise, of course, engaged my threat system. And of course, what happened was I went along to my doctor. I got some tranquilizers. And of course, what happened, while I had the tranquilizers, was that my voices attacked me very, very aggressively again, and they escalated the phenomenology. So don't ask me how this happens, don't know. Okay, but what voices did was create this feeling of tension in my abdomen and my chest. And then they ratcheted the tension up. So I could literally feel it physically moving, up my chest with voices making threats at me. Is this what you want to feel like for the rest of eternity? Or like this, a step further, a step more aggressive, a step more threatening, a step more awful in terms of feeling. Or perhaps like this. So this is this voice called God, by the way, who is threatening me with these things. Okay, this for me was so bad that I actually just took a bottle of tranquilizers that I had just got because I decided I'm not living with this. It's just not worth it. I mean, quite frankly. And of course, so this would have been a complete surprise to anybody had that been successful. Fortunately, you take a whole bottle of tranquilizers, all that happens is you sleep for 2 days. And I actually woke up okay to discover that I had actually got up in the middle of it and gone off to work. So it's a little funny from that point of view, as a story. But if I'd had other things in the house, I mean, that could have been a completely different point of view. So of course, this is the spiral down towards sort of suicide risk. It's this feeling of helplessness. It's the realization that it's chronic, it's not going away, that actually voices can come back at any time and make it hell for you. And as I say, they can impose this phenomenology as torture on you and say, this me was so bad that I just decided, not worth it, I'm out of here. And so this would have been a complete surprise to anybody because I hadn't even been talking about, in fact, I'd been fine, sort of up to here. This was literally just the weekend, and only one friend actually knew, that I'd actually gone to the doctor, as a result of that. But that was a very high risk moment for me. Now, if I had been able to anticipate this, I would have had, it would have been a completely different, conversation that I would be having, here. And this is the point. I'm saying actually we can anticipate this stuff because this actually is kind of how the journey or the experience of this sort of unfolds. So the next big thing came for me actually was, I found my NLP response again and I modified it. So instead of just interrupting voices, I kind of said to them, you miserable so-and-sos, you're actually not who you say you are, okay? This was a complete surprise because you came along being, again, very threatening as God, and as God actually was at the stage, making all kinds of threats, which were really, and let's say an experienced in a terrifying way. So I said, bleep you, you'll be whoever I damn well say you are. And I say this is when I created the caricatures of my voices. I exaggerated their worst features. And of course, what this did was it made me more objective about them. It gave me a way to kind of recognize what they were doing. It gave me a way to kind of to minimize it. Even though I was exaggerating it in the caricature, at the same time, I was actually minimizing it because I could see it for what it was. I think that's really what was sort of going on there. And then I named them little names because I thought, if you miserable blimmin' so-and-sos, if you're going to give me a hard time, I'm just going to mock you to death, was my response. So, of course, God became Squealy. The two other voices became Tutu and Poopsie. But, of course, the other big thing that gave, that did for me was I had an instant response. I had one word that I could use to respond always. So even if I'm caught by surprise and my threat system is engaged, I can say, Squealy, bleep off. We're not gonna do that. And of course, I've since learned to spot the signs of getting there. But and of course, that'll cover it in the my strategies as well. But this was a huge thing. This helped me. This was helping me own the transaction. This NLP response. This over here helped me own the relationship because it took away their power, and it was also me responding in anger. I kind of said, you can bleep off. You will be whatever I tell you you are. And of course, this is how I actually pushed through the fear. And I actually said to this miserable thing, that, if you are God, and if you are an evil God as you claim, then I'm screwed anyway. We're all screwed. So what have I got to lose? Okay, so this was my approach to it. And actually, it was the best thing I did because I simply said, what's the worst you miserable things can do? You can, make the phenomenology so bad that it's intolerable. This miserable little so-and-so here called Poopsie has kept me awake for 5 days at about this time, which was absolutely awful. And I just kept saying, the worst that can happen is I'll land up in the emergency room. I get my doctor there, they'll lock me out for 2 days. I said, and then what are you going to do, Poopsie? And of course, from then on, I owned the relationship. So this was owning the response, owning the relationship. And those of course, were big steps that created the space for me in which I was then able to actually dive into this thing and sort of withdraw and dive into it and withdraw, because every time I picked the stuff up, every time I picked up my notepad to make notes, I've got 5,000 pages of notes, literally. And those are the ones I've kept as opposed to the ones I've thrown away. That created this sort of space of objectivity where I played with these voices, and I conducted, as I say, these thought experiments, where I was then sort of testing, pushing, prodding, and of course learning more about myself and the mind at the same time. So May 2015, I came up with the first model, which now looks like this. My story model is that it was I've got progressed over a year, to get to this, but basically I came up with these sort of 5 themes here, more or less, fairly early on, and I connected mind and body, sort of later on. And of course, this completely changed my perception, my understanding of voices, and of course, but also my perception of the experience of them. And as I say, there were 2 things for me here that I kind of struggled with. The one was that I actually realized that really, these things are so miserable. They're presenting this catch-22, and from that, there is no good outcome. At best you can minimize harm, and that really angers me. I say not that it didn't just make me angry, it angered me. So I was left with this lingering anger. So every time voices prodded me, I was more this. What the bleep do you think you're actually doing? And of course, eventually I found a way to manage the anger. That was actually quite a difficult piece. And I reckon actually that anger, of course, is much better than fear and paranoia. Of course, I was directing my anger at voices, at least in the sense of, sort of aiming my thoughts, if you like, at them. And if it became too much, I could get up and yell, scream, or walk outside and yell and scream, but it wasn't disturbing my neighbors. But I say at least anger is something that is easy to manage, and it's putting you in your drive system rather than having you in your threat system. So this is still getting through the fear and paranoia. It was my anger that made me say to these guys, "What the bleep do you think you're doing? If you're an evil god, I'm screwed anyway. We all are. So there's nothing I can do about it. So get on with it." Was my approach. And of course, they still proceeded to try and make the experience particularly bad. But of course, in time, you recognize that their threats are actually hollow, empty threats, that actually the problem with them is the experience of them, because the experience is awful, you anticipate them. And of course, all the worrying about what they can do is actually just getting in the way of you doing what you want to do. And I say it took me a while to kind of get there. I'm hoping that if others see this whole thing, they get there a lot quicker, of course, than I do. And of course, the other thing with this, of course, this for me is the depression risk. This is not stuff I want to live with. I don't want to live with the fact that actually voices are getting in the way of my life outcomes all the time. For me, it's actually, past the point of it's redirected what I do. I wouldn't be doing this work. I'd be working as a management consultant. So it's completely redirected my life. And as, of course, I've progressed, I found ways to use my management consulting skills, in this space. So I managed to get it to the point where at least I'm enjoying some of it. But overall, as I say, it's definitely knocked my quality of life. It still irritates me no end. That voices bother me when I go to bed at night. They wake me up in the middle of the night, disturb my sleep. It bothers me when I'm taking a walk, walking the dogs, for example. I've got voices badgering me. It's an irritation. It's not, meaningful in that sense. It's not getting in the way of my sort of purpose in life, but it's an irritation. It's occupying the mind at times when I'm actually trying to have fun. And that for me is still, although it's an irritation, it's this intellectually, I know that this thing is getting in the way of my life, and that irritates me and annoys me. And of course, I can ignore it for most of the week, and then somewhere once in the week, I'll just say, fly away voices. And of course, that's the piece you learn to manage the anger, because I decided I didn't want to be an angry old man. I object to the idea that I had to decide not to be an angry old man, because I actually used to be, the most patient and placid person around. So of course, as I discovered one model, I actually then realized I had something. So I had a response. I had a way to push back on the kind of beliefs and reduce the intensity, and I had a way to describe, how we're actually giving meaning to it. And of course, this is when I started. By this stage now, I was going to hearing voices meetings. that was actually prompted me to go to Hearing Voices meetings, and I started going to conferences and approaching academics. And I had sort of conversations, and of course, I realized actually that the best way to make a difference was, to actually work with researchers, and I kind of developed, to say, these other models. So the model of kind of perception that you've seen, and I say there's a lot more to this, the model of our emotional systems and the relationship between information and emotion, which you'll see in other things. This was me, trying to appeal now, as I say, here it was to voice hearers, then it was to mental health professionals, and then to researchers. And of course, I changed, what I was actually doing. And of course, what I found, of course, is that I'm this crazy engineer, trying to make headway in this space. And I've got some good conversations and some really good references from some academics and some professionals in the field. I still haven't actually managed to find a research group to work with. So of course, what I'm doing is I'm putting all this stuff up on YouTube, so I can say to my voices, bleep off, the bulk of the work is actually out there. And I will find a research organization to work with. So 2 things to look at here. So the stuff above the line is my story. So this was unique to me. This stuff down here, though, I think is stuff, we have voices were getting in the way. This is stuff that I think pretty much everybody who experiences voices will experience in some way or another. I haven't really, I should say here, in these episodes, of course, I did actually experience, enough fear and paranoia to book into a hotel for 6 weeks, to call friends in a panic, for, my brother and my sister-in-law to come, one from Durban, one from Cape Town, Johannesburg rather, to fetch me in Cape Town, what have you. So there's the fear and paranoia, in these sort of episodes here. The other one, I say, is the mania. I spent lots of time where voices, were encouraging me. And of course, what that was doing was stealing mind share, leading me down dead ends, wasted, all this time, voices patting me on the back and encouraging me and saying, oh, how cute you are, how smart you are, smartest man in the world, most important man in the world, all that nonsense. But of course, what it's doing is your brain is recognizing it, and it's stimulating your reward signals, and you're going into this manic phase. And of course, what it's doing, it's pleasant for a short period, or even for a long period, weeks, but it's not building your story. It's not actually helping you live the kind of life you would ordinarily, kind of lead. So what I'm saying is, this line up here is something that would be, unique to the individual. For me, I made voices my life. Of course, what I'm hoping, of course, is that others will recognize, having learned all the stuff they can learn from others, use this stuff to kind of say, I'm not going to let voices rule my life, and focus on, the My Story model to say, what kind of life do I want to lead? And of course, then recognize that actually, if voices are pestering you and have been for a long time, you're allowed to go through this kind of journey. And of course, some of these are sort of low points. And then let's find, what are the high points in your life, that you have to sort of compensate for them. And of course, I also apply, sort of mind strategies to help me manage the transactions. So when I step back, for me, is the piece that really, as I say, angers me, is I look at this and I say, this experience, what a waste of mind share time. Yes, great. I've done some, I think pretty good stuff in terms of understanding this. Great. It's not stuff that I actually would have set out to do. It's not stuff, obviously, if I hadn't heard voices, I would never have got to it. And of course, as I say, it still redirected my life, because I found the experience so vile. And as I say, I keep looking at the idea that there are 300 million people experiencing it that don't know what to do, that are experiencing this kind of thing. This actually finding help is incredibly difficult. So I'm saying what we can do is we can use this kind of model. That, I obviously would like to work with, with researchers to improve this. But the idea is understand this journey. I've got a pretty good idea of what it's like, and improve it. But the point is to anticipate, the journey, and to provide people with the right information and the right support along the way. And of course, the other one is to actually offer people strategies that we can apply in the mind. This no response. So how, this NLP response, this minimizing, the voices, as opposed to letting them intensify your experience. You can minimize the intensity of the experience. And of course, what this is doing is building confidence. So this is working on, your interpretations in the mind, but more importantly, building your emotional systems to build confidence. And of course, this is actually helping you, get your story back on track. So those are the main sort of learnings actually from this thing. The one is that actually the two things are working together. So it's actually, I've described it, where it's a problem with voices as the intensity of the experience. So in ordinary life, this is the quality of the experiences that we're, that we're having, of course, and of course, intensity is a part, of the quality. So I'm saying that actually the quality of our experiences and sort of how they progress, so how one experience leads to another. This is our reward signals kicking in. But actually, these two axes are the things that really matter, that voices are getting in the way with. So what they're doing is they're disrupting the quality and giving us intense, unpleasant experiences. And of course, that's one thing that's wiring the brain. The other thing is, what would ordinarily be satisfying my reward progression would be my story, how I'm building my story, how I'm becoming a more interesting person, how I'm doing stuff that builds a career or a home, or whatever life it is I've chosen. And that actually what we need to be doing is looking at our rewards, in terms of our story. So, I could say I am, I detest saying, I'm a voice hearer. I say I'm a business strategist and a voice hearer. I actually don't like adding that piece. Of course, it's relevant in terms of the work that I'm doing. For me, it's not an experience that I want sort of acknowledged or normalized. For me, it's something that's just got in the way. And of course, I want to help other people get on with loving the life that they lead. So I call it Love Life, laughing out loud. So in the mind strategies, I will kind of show us how to use mindfulness, referencing this kind of framework to actually displace voices. And of course, the second thing to do is that recognize that. So this is our interpretation of it and the outcomes that we're achieving. The other thing, of course, is to manage the transactions. And the importance of managing the transactions is actually that this is how you're building up your emotional systems, your emotional strength, your resilience. And of course, what you're trying to do is, if you can create positive transactions, what you're doing is actually building your self-assuredness. I mentioned that this experience had very much knocked my self-confidence, not so much my concept of self, but because voices were undermining what I was trying to do. And what I was trying to do about building getting my life back on track, building a future. And of course, they were doing that by dominating up here, and they're kind of saying they have all the answers to the meaning of life, when they don't. In fact, they were trying to make the meaning of life, sort of awful. Those transactions were undermining my resilience and my confidence, and that was because they were undermining the transactions. And if you can own the transactions, you can actually build a sense of security, you can build a sense of optimism, and actually you can build a sense of confidence. And that's what you want to do. This is how you want to think of the emotional systems. You want to think that I have three, basically, and if I can actually, assert principles, to help me, live the kind of life I want to lead, and I use those same principles to react, in terms of how I react and respond to voices. Then actually, I will make them less important, and I will make, my ordinary story more significant. And this is the point you want to do, is by voices, imposing themselves up here as God, the devil, ancestors, aliens. They're trying to assert a level, a relationship of power over you. And what you want to do is bring the power back to your own ability to create the life that you actually want to live, and you want to give, put the significance to what you're doing to create the kind of life that you want. So once again, it's about the phenomenon. It's not about us as individuals. You're not mentally ill. It's this weird phenomenon that's arriving, throwing all this nonsense at you. And of course, what it's doing is it's actually disrupting your thinking, which is disrupting the way you live your life. It's actually interrupting what you're trying to do. It's certainly interrupting your thinking. It's replacing what you would ordinarily be thinking about, even though you might not know what you would otherwise have been doing. But remember that your mind is on all the time. If you're thinking about voices, that's time you could have been doing something else. So it's actually displacing you from your life. And what I'm saying, actually, you'll see in the mind strategy, is that this is exactly what I do to voices. I just flick it around. So by creating the caricatures and I'm disrupting them and their teams. As they throw something at me, I interrupt it. I replace it with something pleasant, and I put the focus mindfully on my story. So I actually displaced the significance never asserted in my life. And that is how I respond to the phenomenology. And of course, the mind strategies are about practical ways to do this, that become a habit. So once again, thanks for listening to this video. I'd like to keep as much as possible of this material free for people who hear voices, since many can't afford it. To do that, I have this fundraiser on crowdrise.com called Someone You Know Hears Voices. If you're commenting on social media, please use #MadSense. If you're a researcher and would like to work together on developing all this experience mapping, all 3 videos that relate to it, that's how you can contact me, greg@mad-sense.com. And of course, as always, there are plenty of other important and valuable contributors in the space that would also welcome support. So please support whoever you can. Thank you for listening.